Chuma, Solstefort, Chickasaw Nompana, ma Solstefort, Locos Chickasaw athlete sao Chifotuk. Ing mad himmakono sayo pa antlika. Ine board members momaka sayo pa hasamasla antlika. Ing mad Ada ko amintili Chickasaw saya angkiet mashkogi chala gita sashkit Chickasaw chatata naholo saubogya Chickasaw saya Iman himakono nan katishit amanumpat itanala katok hachimanoli lachon Ingmat makonogya nana hachimanoli ligmat yapafkat nahlo manompa hulasochili tokat kot anompa hole ligmat ish ridaka Ingmat hopa kikashono chiho akot hatak Chickasaw poto batok Ingmat chiho akot pomanompa pomatok mya Sipugne atlet Chickasaw nompa illa honompa holin na tugmya Ingmat Chickasaw nompa illa hoatana tugmya Pung kamasa atlet nanagya pingsaka Chickasaw nompa ho chifo tugmya Hatak atlet nanamisa alba Shilombosh nanagya pingsaka Chickasaw pung kamasa ho chifotok Chickasaw nompa ma nanagya ho chifotok mya anompa illa Chickasaw nompa illa ho etana tok mya ho pa Chickasaw no pung kamasa atlet hokani kayo patok mya Imanompa nompa holik mat ho ayo patok mea Chickasaw nompa illa ho nompa holik na tok mea ho beno maacha ho tiba nompa holik na tok mea Chickasaw nompa illa ho tana tok Saskano se katinkash Chickasaw sayata Chickasaw saya Ingmat itana lituk. Anchoka chafa atlet nana noli ho nompo lenakat itana lituk ogya. Chickasaw nompa kanumpo lukituk. Anchoka chafa atlet naniksho Chickasaw nompa itana tuk mea. Anakut saskino se katinkas Chickasaw nompa kanumpo lukituk. Chickasaw nompa kot Akitano kitok. Saoshi alagma. Nana Chickasaw nompa. Hapomoga atlet. Nana etana sabana tok. Hatakot chukfi. Hochifolitok. Nana hatak atlet. Pomanompa. Itana sabana tok hatakot Chickasaw nompa akitano kitok Chickasaw nompa akot akanumpa lokitok Ingma Chickasaw nompa itana shtalitok Nana lewa kat Poma nompa lewa Itana likat shtalitok Chickasaw nompa itana Nana lewa Imasisalanin na tok Ingma Chickasaw nompa honlilit shtalitok Anakut Chickasaw nompa itana lanit sabana tok Amma nompa honlilit sabana tok Chickasaw nompa ichumat Chickasaw nompa tana ichumat ibino macha ilitiba nompa honlilit na tok mea Makonogit punch puta, Chickasaw non pama, imanolilika. Makono get, Chickasaw non pek, sampon no kinsho get, ayasa chile kyokachi. Chickasaw non pohonlele, ampon achik manoanle. Asayok pa, makono himak nitaka. Asayo pa chiho akut, Chickasaw satobatuk. Himak nitakat asayok pa. Chickasaw nompat pomatuk. Iman himaka nitakat asayo pa tukut Chickasaw nompolebika. Chickasaw nompa iman nompa poma nompa nompohole le bilea. Bileashki. So I said, you were reading what I was saying, but I told you who I was in Chickasaw. My name is Lokosh, which means gourd, like the water gourds that the Pueblos use, or the gourd rattles that our peyote church people use. Speaker named me Lokosh because of my gourd-like shape. So that's what they call me in Chickasaw. I told you that my mother is Chickasaw and Choctaw and white. My dad is Creek and Cherokee and white. So I'm enrolled with the Chickasaw Nation because my mother is Chickasaw and her mother was Chickasaw and her mother was Chickasaw. For as long as we know, back on her side, we've been Chickasaw people. And in the Chickasaw way, that's how we get our clan. So I'm from the Panther clan, and my house is called Imatapo. It used to mean people that live under the arbor, but now it means tent people. It's not a very exciting house name, but that's what it is. So anyway, Ane asked me to come and talk a little bit about my experiences as a second language learner of Chickasaw. And I don't know that I'm really going to cover anything that these presenters that covered, that talked before me, what they talked about. We hit a lot on the same things because there's something really powerful and transforming in ways that's hard to describe about learning to speak your native language. So what this says is, Katishtiam Manopa Atamitam. How is it that I came to speak my language, or how is it that I came to learn my language? So a lot of times what we talk about is speaker motivation, or specifically learner motivation. And for me, beginning as a kid, I was a strange little kid, and I really cared a lot for my traditions in ways that my brother didn't care about, and my other cousins, they didn't care about. And I think my granny, my Chickasaw granny, saw this, and so she kind of encouraged me. And just so you understand, I didn't come up on our traditional community. I didn't come up in Oklahoma. We're originally from Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, and Kentucky, but we were removed in 1837 to Oklahoma, to Indian Territory. And while my mother's family is from Chickasaw Nation in Oklahoma, I was not born there. I wasn't raised there. I didn't really spend a whole lot of time there other than with my great-grandmother in the summers. So I think that our family was pretty typical, mixed blood, kind of urban Chickasaw family, and that we just knew, we were politically active, we knew our history, our family history, but we weren't cultural. My granny gave me one of our dictionaries as a kid, and so I was really interested in it. And I think out of that, I really wanted to learn my language. I mentioned in the earlier part of the talk that one of my big motivations for learning to speak my language was to be able to pass something on to my kids, specifically my son Chokfi. His name means rabbit in our language. And I wanted to give him something more substantial than his tribal citizenship. I wanted to give him something more substantial than his enrollment card or his CDIB card or these other things that say how much Indian he is or is not. And for me, the value and the key and everything about Chickasaw lies in that language, so I decided to learn it. I really, really wanted to learn it, not only for me, but for my kids. And so I think that motivation is something that you just cannot ask people to have. They either get it and they take it and they run with it, or they don't get it. We can encourage people, don't get me wrong. We encourage people in our program all the time to pick up Chickasaw. But those that really will pick it up in a way and make that lifestyle change that it takes to become a speaker are few and far between. So the second thing I did was I really searched for language resources. I spent a lot of time finding not only our published resources, but all of the archival materials I could find. Word lists from the 1800s, from the 1700s, published dictionaries, anything I could find. And a part of those resources were also our speaker community. I started coming back to our service area in the early 2000s, and I identified every single speaker that I could find. So when I was there during the summers, they were my language resources, and I would ask them over and over and over. And they would say, God, do you know this guy? He's from Albuquerque. He's this big white-looking guy who's a Chickasaw. I was living in Albuquerque at the time. And he's been bothering me for language. He keeps on asking me, how do you say this? How do you say that? But eventually they figured out that I wasn't going to go away. And so we spent a lot of time together. The third thing I did was I just really, really intensely studied, and I gave myself over to it. Not only like reading, out of the materials, but spending time with our elders. I did a whole lot of listening and not as much speaking initially. As I mentioned earlier, I spent lots of time with our speakers, primarily 3 or 4 speakers. I failed to mention that my grandmother that spoke Chickasaw died in 1938. So I had no speakers in my family. Even my grandma, who was my Chickasaw granny, who was really encouraging to me. I don't think she could say anything in Chickasaw. So I'm the first speaker in my family in a long time. So I went to people that I wasn't really related to or really distantly related to. One of the main things that I did that I think encouraged my language development more than anything else was I realized that I couldn't do what I wanted to do in Albuquerque. I couldn't do what I wanted to do in Texas, where I grew up. With one exception, all of our speakers live in Oklahoma. And with maybe 2 exceptions, all of them live in our service area. And so I said to myself, well, I need to get a job with the tribe. I have to make a living, support my family. And so I took the first job I could get to get back to Oklahoma and to Chickasaw Nation. And the ability to see our speakers day in and day out and be able to ask them and learn to say things with them, that really just sort of pushed my learning into a whole nother level. Another thing that I did was I was not afraid to speak Chickasaw. I got up here and I rattled off. I put in English what, you guys were reading, and I was just translating these things on the fly. And I probably said something wrong. I'm sure if there was a Chickasaw speaker here, they would say, oh, look, she didn't say that right. You should have said da-da-da-da-da. And that's okay. I'm a big boy, I can take my licks. But I think the thing that holds adult learners back is we're just too self-conscious. We're afraid of looking foolish, we're afraid of being wrong, we're afraid of kind of getting back into our kid head and saying silly things just like, our kids say. Well, I'm a little crazy, just a little bit, and I think that helps when you're trying to pick up your language. I'm sure all these second language learners and a lot of our native speakers are a little crazy too. To commit yourself to something like this is, it takes a little bit of crazy in the back of your head. So I spoke Chickasaw without fear. I'd say ridiculous things. I would ask someone to come sit by me, and I would end up saying, please come sit on my leg. And lots of other things that were just really inappropriate. But I didn't know it. And everybody says, oh, Josh, he doesn't know any better. He didn't come up around us. It's okay. He doesn't know any better. I've been around long enough that it doesn't work quite as good anymore. But at the time it was real helpful. One thing that I did was sort of foster environments for myself to use my language. This isn't anything new. Leanne Hinton talks about it in her book. All of us second language learners know this. I mean, you have to talk to yourself. You make up things in your mind. You imagine how to say things. You creating new words and then saying, hey, what do you think about this word I made up for pizza? Or how about this word for cell phone? You do wordplay. You talk to yourself. I had imaginary conversations with the speaker in my head. Talking to yourself in the shower about what you're going to do that day. Anything that I could do to put Chickasaw into my mind and then coming out of my mouth was something that I did. Even now, a thing that I constantly have to remind myself is that I'm always learning until, and I don't think I'll ever get here, but until I'm at the point where I can completely, unselfconsciously produce confident language with the speaker without hems or haws or stops or buts or ums. I haven't arrived. And I don't really know that I'll ever get to the point of our native speakers, but I'm constantly learning. I learn something new every day. And even now, as I'm in a position of leadership in the tribal language program, I find my acquisition slowing, and this is a scary thing for me. So I have to constantly remind myself, you're still learning, and you are not good enough yet, and you shouldn't quit. So whether it's speaking to myself, speaking to my wife who doesn't speak Chickasaw, talking to my kids who understand a lot, to my employees, to the speakers that work with us, I'm constantly talking Chickasaw. So, this final part of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about the personal transformation that I experienced in learning my language. How learning my language changed me. So one thing it did, we all know about this connection, we hear about it. This gentleman from Mohawk community in Canada talked about it. Language is this culture. Culture is the language. You can't have one without the other. And it's easy to talk about that in English, but it really is true. I had a sort of a peripheral identity as a Chickasaw person. No, you know what I really say was what I was coming up was, I was a white kid who was part Chickasaw. And this is really weird to say this, especially for our full-blood people and our conservative community members. They say, how can you be a white guy, part Chickasaw, and now you're saying you're a Chickasaw who just happens to be part white? Well, this is a lived experience for me. Learning the language took my head and shook it up and changed how I think about myself. And so I'm a proud Chickasaw who happens to be part white. And I claim my other tribal heritages, and I claim my ethnic European heritage, but I'm a Chickasaw person through and through. And this is something that I really couldn't say a long time ago, 10 or more years ago. So learning the language strengthened my identity as a Chickasaw person. Another thing it did for me was it made a place for me with our conservative people, with our elders, with our community people. These are all real deal, born and bred, conservative, living in the woods, wood stove, eating squirrel, Chickasaw people. Okay? And then there's me. Sometimes it's hard for non-phenotypical Indian people, and I'm not just talking about in Chickasaw, but it's a challenge for us in some of our communities to be accepted. And initially, I ran into some pushback from people, and understandably so. They have a long experience, negative experiences with people that look like me. But over time they realized, this is a serious guy. We fact-checked him. We figured out who his people are. We know he's a Chickasaw. And now that I speak Chickasaw, you have these strange, surreal experiences where there's not any difference between me and my 92-year-old
elder speaker. It reconnected me with my history. I knew my family history in sort of a surface way, but because of the language, I was able to get back into what we used to do, who we were, our clan names, our house people, where we came from, all these things. So I find myself in this strange position where I'm educating my aunties and uncles and even my Chickasaw grandmother, things that our family had forgotten a long time ago. And this is not something I would have known had I not received the language from our elders. It also opened doors for me to experiences, cultural experiences, and sort of a depth of understanding that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I've been able to apprentice with some of our community people and learn how to lead our ceremonial songs. I'm a leader at our ceremonial ground. Came back to our Indian church. My family was Indian church a long time ago, but we hadn't been for some time, so I learned to sing our hymns and read Bible again and so forth in the language. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Learning to do things like make stickball sticks, participate in our ceremonial games, all these things that I would not have had access to had I not picked up my language. This is one thing I think that really is meaningful for me. I went over before the talk, I went over to the restroom to wash my face off because I was real nervous. I get real nervous in front of people. All these people I don't know, except for my Creeks in the back. And I was praying, and now that I have my language, I can pray to God in Chickasaw. And that's, I don't mean that flippantly. I mean, whether I'm giving praise or whether I'm scared about giving a talk, being able to just put it out there in the language that I think that He intended for me to speak to Him in. Pretty powerful stuff. It also gave me, as I said before, the ability to learn to speak and understand and sing our ceremonial ground songs. And also, in particular, I'm able to read the scriptures in the Choctaw language, which is a related language. And reading and singing and praying to God in that Chickasaw language has really mean a lot to me. It also gave me a cultural legacy. In my family, we all went to boarding school. And my grannies went to boarding schools that were run by my own tribe. And even in our own tribal boarding schools, they weren't allowed to speak Indian. And so, like I said, it had been several generations since 1938 that we have been able to fluently speak our language. They hadn't been able to practice their culture. They hadn't been able to do any of these things. And now I have something that I can give to my children and to their children and to my descendants in the future. It gave me a creative outlet. I do a lot of writing in Chickasaw. I find in some way writing down what happens to me during the day and creating new songs and writing things in Chickasaw helps me speak Chickasaw. I'm not sure how that works. I'm sure there's some reason for that in academic research. But it's really cool to be able to write new hymns and compose new ceremonial ground songs and perform them for our people. For me, learning the language, it wasn't just for me, it wasn't just for my family. It was for all of my extended family and all of my people, because our youngest, fluent speakers are now in their 60s. So I'm the youngest conversational speaker of our language. And it gave me a way to provide for my family, not just a job or a career, but as I say here, a calling or a mission, so that when I get up in the morning and I'm thankful and I'm praying and I'm just really happy that I have something that I don't have to call a job. I have something that really motivates me to get out of bed. So the title of this talk here is Amanompa Saya, which means I am my language, which is strange. I mean, maybe we've heard it, maybe we haven't. There's several books out there with titles, something along those lines. But for me, when I say I am my language, what I mean is our language really encompasses everything that is Chickasaw. Learning our language gives us access to the minds of our ancestors. Some of our presenters have talked about this. I really feel connected in ways to the old folks that I didn't before. And understanding, in Chickasaw we call them kamasa, understanding the mind of kamasa gives us access to things that we couldn't have understood otherwise. And I think speaking the language has made me more Chickasaw. When we speak our language, we express out in the world where other people can hear it what it means to be Chickasaw. They know that we are Chickasaw by the language we speak. We speak Chickasaw. We are Chickasaw. We are our language, and our language is us. Learning to speak my language has really changed my life in ways that it's really hard to describe. It's hard to get across in this presentation, in this format. Even though it's hard to get up and talk in front of all these people, I hope what I get across is that my gratefulness to our old folks who spent time, with me. How thankful I am to our ancestors who, rather than giving up, decided to make it to Indian territory and who decided to continue our way of life even though we had to leave behind the bones of our ancestors in Mississippi. I really appreciate those 7,500 people that we have left who can still speak Chickasaw fluently and who saw fit to take me in and not only teach me how to speak my language, but how to be a really good Chickasaw person. So I think that's all I have. I just want to say Chukmashki and Yakoke. I appreciate the opportunity to be around with all you good people. It's really uplifting to be with language people today. So Chukmashki.